Imagine standing at the iron gates of 1000 Ashbourne Road in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, on a cold November morning in 1915. The air smells of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the sky above is the color of wet pewter. Behind those gates, stretching across 300 acres of manicured Pennsylvania countryside, rises the most staggering private residence in the history of America's most extravagant age, a neoclassical limestone palace 268 feet long, 215 feet deep, 110 rooms assembled from the rarest materials on Earth, built at a cost of $8 million, which in today's money equals $310 million. Every stone quarried in Indiana, and every fixture imported from the workshops of Paris. The fountains in the French gardens have been silenced for the season. The 33-acre grounds are still and perfectly groomed. 100 servants move through the corridors. The gas lamps along the drive glow amber in the gray morning air. And in an upstairs chamber, surrounded by silk wallpaper and the hushed footsteps of a household afraid to breathe too loudly, the man who built all of this is dying. His name is Peter Orell Brown Widener. He is 80 years old. He has been the richest man in Philadelphia, one of the wealthiest human beings on the entire North American continent. He has eaten dinner with presidents and outbid kings for paintings. He has laid the steel rails beneath the feet of every man, woman, and child who ever rode a trolley car in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore. He co-founded United States Steel. He helped organize the American Tobacco Company. He was a silent partner in Standard Oil. His personal art collection, Rembrandt, Raphael, Monet, Degas, Van Dyck, El Greco, Velázquez, was worth more than the annual budget of most American cities. He raised a family in this palace and called it paradise. But on this gray November morning, November 6th, 1915, Peter Widener does not look like a king. He looks like a man who has been broken. His body has been ravaged by diabetes for 3 years. His eyes, once described by contemporaries as sharp and restless as a hawk's, are now still, directed at the ceiling in a way that suggests he is no longer looking at the plaster above him, but at something much farther away. The attending physician has already been summoned. The household waits. What the servants who stand in the corridors that morning do not fully understand, what perhaps even Peter himself in his final hours cannot completely comprehend, is that the mansion around him, for all its marble and bronze and gilded light, has already been a haunted house for 3 years. Because in April of 1912, the sea swallowed 2 members of the Widener family, his son, his grandson, and the man who built this empire, who began with nothing more than a butcher's knife and an immigrant's hunger, never fully recovered from that night. This is the story of Linwood Hall, the story of a family's rise from the mud of Philadelphia's back streets to the marble halls of America's Versailles. The story of how one of the greatest private art collections ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere was built, displayed, loved, and ultimately given away. And the story of how a $310 million palace was eventually sold for $192,000, abandoned to silence and decay, reduced to a ghost standing in the Pennsylvania woods, until, nearly a century after the man who built it drew his last breath, someone finally decided it was worth saving. But the story begins not here, not in this cold November bedroom. It begins 50 years earlier in the back streets of Philadelphia, where the smell is not of French perfume, but of blood and sawdust. In the year 1834, Philadelphia was a city in the process of becoming something enormous. The cobblestones along Market Street rattled with the iron wheels of horse-drawn wagons. The wharves along the Delaware River groaned under the weight of cotton bales and timber. Smoke rose from the chimneys of textile mills. The city was the second largest in America, and it was hungry for labor, hungry for commerce, hungry for the kind of raw ambition that only the children of the working poor seemed to fully possess. On November 13th of that year, a boy was born in North Philadelphia to Johannes Widener, German-descended brick manufacturer, and his wife Sarah Fulmer. They named the boy Peter Orell Brown Widener, after a prominent Philadelphia lawyer, a name too large by half of the narrow row house where he first drew breath, but a name the boy would one day grow to fill. The world Peter Widener entered was one of calloused hands and long hours. His father's brick trade kept the family solvent but not comfortable. The smell of Peter's childhood was clay and cold dust. The sound of it was hammers and cartwheels, and the texture of it was rough and gritty, like the brick his father shaped for a living. What separated Peter from the other boys of his neighborhood was not luck. It was mathematics. At Central High School in Philadelphia, he was said to be extraordinary with numbers, not just the mechanics of arithmetic, but the strategic geometry of commerce, the ability to look at a transaction and see, with an almost physical clarity, where the profit lay and where the trap was hidden. He could calculate the value of a deal faster than men twice his age. He noticed things. He filed them away. He waited. At the age of 17, Peter Widener left school and went to work as a butcher's apprentice. If this strikes you as an unglamorous beginning for a man who would one day own Rembrandts, consider that in 1851, a butcher shop was one of the most essential commercial institutions in any American city. Meat was not bought from refrigerated cases wrapped in plastic. It was a fresh negotiation every morning between the man with the knife and the man with the coin. Peter learned the trade with the same intensity he had brought to his mathematics. Watching, absorbing, cataloging the patterns of supply and demand that governed the daily flow of customers through his employer's door. Within a few years, he had saved enough to open his own shop. Then a second. Then a chain of meat stores spread across North Philadelphia, each one a small engine of revenue that he ran with the precision of a machine. He was frugal in his personal habits. His suits were respectable but not ostentatious. His meals were plain. His pleasures were modest. But every dollar his shops generated, he reinvested, turning profit into capital with the compulsive efficiency of a man who has tasted poverty and decided, with a cold and absolute certainty, that he will never taste it again. On August 18, 1858, Peter Widener married Hannah Josephine Dutton, the daughter of a Philadelphia family of quiet respectability. By all contemporary accounts, Hannah was a woman of remarkable warmth and social grace, the kind of person who could make a room feel like a home regardless of whether its furniture was modest or magnificent. Peter, for all his commercial ferocity, loved her with a depth that surprised those who knew only his business face. They moved into a modest home on Girard Avenue and began a family. Their first son, also named Harry, arrived in 1859. Their second, George Dunton, was born in 1861, and their third and youngest, Joseph Early, arrived in 1871. In that same year of 1861, a war began that would change everything. When the Confederate artillery opened on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Peter Widener was 26 years old, the owner of several meat shops, a young husband, and a man with a talent for identifying opportunity. He did not see the Civil War as a tragedy first, though he was not without patriotic sentiment. He saw it, with that cool mathematical eye, as a supply problem of extraordinary scale. The Union Army camped around Philadelphia required enormous quantities of fresh meat to sustain itself. Someone had to provide it. Peter Widener decided that someone would be him. He secured a government contract, reportedly after considerable political maneuvering through his connections in the Philadelphia Republican Party, to supply mutton to all Union Army troops stationed within 10 miles of the city. The contract, according to accounts from the period, earned him $50,000 in profit. In today's purchasing power, that is roughly $1.8 million, and it arrived not gradually but in the compressed, intense time frame of wartime necessity. It was the first large sum of money Peter Widener had ever possessed, and he treated it not as wealth to be enjoyed, but as fuel for something larger. He looked at the horse-drawn streetcar lines that were beginning to spread across Philadelphia's expanding neighborhoods, and saw what no one else seemed quite ready to see, that the city was going to grow, and that whatever method it used to move its citizens from home to work and back again would become the circulatory system of an entire urban civilization. Whoever controlled that circulatory system would control the city's economic pulse. He invested his $50,000 in horse car companies. He partnered with two men of similar strategic vision, William Lukens Elkins, a kerosene merchant who understood energy infrastructure, and William H. Kimball, a political operative with connections that opened doors other men couldn't find. Together, the three of them set about consolidating Philadelphia's fragmented transit lines under unified control. The speed with which they moved was astonishing even by the standards of the Gilded Age. By the 1880s, the trio had not only unified Philadelphia's transit systems, but had begun replicating their model in other American cities. New York, Chicago, in partnership with the flamboyant and controversial Charles Yerkes, whose own story of transit empire building and political bribery would eventually inspire Theodore Dreiser's novel The Titan. Pittsburgh, Baltimore, the Widener-Elkins-Kimball Traction Syndicate, as historians would later call it, built more miles of electric trolley lines than any other single organization in American history. The electric streetcar, which replaced the horse-drawn car and transformed what had been a slow, expensive, malodorous means of urban transport into something fast, cheap, and scalable, became the backbone of every major American city in the 1880s and 1890s, and Peter Widener's syndicate was at the heart of it all. The money that flowed from this enterprise was not merely substantial. It was oceanic. By the late 1880s, Widener was already a millionaire many times over. But he did not stop at transit. He was, at his core, a strategic investor, and the same instinct that had made him see the value of urban railways made him see the value of other massive industrial consolidations happening around him. He became one of the founding organizers of the American Tobacco Company in 1890, combining dozens of competing tobacco producers into a national monopoly that controlled the price of cigarettes for a generation. He was a principal partner in the formation of United States Steel in 1901, that landmark merger organized by J.P. Morgan that created what was at the time the largest corporation in American history. He held substantial positions in Standard Oil. He was, by the dawn of the 20th century, one of perhaps a dozen men who could legitimately be said to shape the industrial economy of the United States. His personal fortune had grown to an estimated $100 million, equivalent in modern purchasing power to something approaching $3.5 billion, which placed him on a very short list alongside men named Astor, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. He is today recognized as one of the 100 wealthiest Americans in the entire recorded history of the country. And yet through all of this, through the political maneuvering and the monopoly building and the transcontinental deal-making, Peter Widener carried something inside him that his contemporaries rarely mentioned in their newspaper profiles, but that those who knew him personally described as his truest characteristic. He loved beauty, not the theatrical, self-advertising love of a man who buys art to impress guests, but the quiet, almost scholarly love of a man who stands in front of Rembrandt and feels, in his chest, something he cannot purchase with all the money he has made. His wife Hannah had cultivated this quality in him, or perhaps simply given it permission to show. And when Hannah died in 1896, quietly, at the modest home on Girard Avenue she had always preferred, something in Peter Widener shifted permanently. He had already been planning a new estate. But after Hannah's death, the project became something different. It became a monument, a memorial, an act of love directed at a woman who would never see it and a family that would live inside it in her honor. He founded the Widener Memorial Home for crippled children in her memory, an institution that still operates today. And then he turned his entire surviving attention to the most ambitious construction project of his life. He had been watching a young architect work. His name was Horace Trumbauer, born in Philadelphia in 1868, which made him just 29 years old in 1897. Trumbauer had already demonstrated something extraordinary in his design for gray towers in nearby Glenside, a sprawling neoclassical masterpiece that had announced to Philadelphia that a new architectural intelligence had arrived. When Peter Widener saw Trumbauer's work, he recognized in the young architect the same quality he had always recognized in himself, a ferocious ambition married to exceptional precision. He gave Trumbauer the commission without hesitation. "Design me the finest private residence in America," he reportedly said, or words to that effect. The instruction was clear enough in any language. In the autumn of 1897, ground was broken on 300 acres of rolling Pennsylvania countryside in the township of Elkins Park, 7 miles north of Philadelphia city center. The location was deliberate, close enough to the city to conduct business, far enough to feel like escape. The air there was clean and green, the kind of air that money had always tried to buy its way into. Construction began that fall, and for the next 2 years, the site was a controlled storm of activity. Steel I-beams were shipped from Pittsburgh. Indiana limestone arrived by the trainload. Marble came from Italy and France. Craftsmen were recruited from workshops across Europe. At the peak of construction, more than 500 workers labored on the site simultaneously, their voices and hammers and saws creating a constant roar that the neighboring estates could hear from half a mile away. Trumbauer worked in the Neoclassical revival style, the architectural language of ancient Greece filtered through the formal grandeur of 18th century France, the style of Versailles and the Petit Trianon, the style that America's wealthiest families had adopted as the visual grammar of legitimate aristocracy. The building he designed was T-shaped in plan, its main facade stretching 268 feet from wing to wing. At 215 feet deep, the structure enclosed a staggering volume of interior space, 110 rooms in total, covering approximately 70,000 square feet of floor area. The exterior was composed entirely of Indiana limestone, the same warm, creamy stone used in the construction of the Pentagon and the Empire State Building, quarried in blocks so large and heavy that the wagons carrying them left deep grooves in the Pennsylvania roads. The facade was restrained by the standards of the period. No Gothic turrets, no Victorian excess, no mismatched architectural quotations. Trumbauer had the confidence of a man who knew that true magnificence does not shout. It simply stands. 2 symmetrical wings flanked a central block whose entrance portico was supported by massive ionic columns, their fluted shafts rising 30 feet from a broad stone terrace. The windows were tall and generously proportioned, framed in stone surrounds that caught the morning light and reflected it back in long gold shafts across the lawn. The whole composition had the unhurried authority of a building that expected to be here for centuries. At the center of the front terrace, 2 massive doors waited. They were cast in Florentine bronze, not the yellow gold of ornamental metalwork, but the deep, complex, almost black bronze of Renaissance Italy. Its surface worked with decorative reliefs by craftsmen whose names have been largely forgotten, but whose hands were trained in the tradition of Ghiberti. Those doors weighed several tons each. When you pushed them open, you felt not the swing of a door but the movement of a wall, and the sound they made as they settled back into their frames was a sound like a cathedral falling silent. Step through those bronze doors, and you stand in the main hall of Linwood Hall, and everything the exterior promised is immediately, overwhelmingly delivered. The floor beneath your feet is a mosaic of 9 different varieties of marble sourced from quarries in Italy, Greece, and North Africa. Black Nero Marchina from Spain, white Carrara from Tuscany, vein Portoro from the Ligurian coast, warm cream Botticino from the foothills of the Alps. The walls are clad in Kinstone, the same pale limestone used in the construction of many of the great Norman cathedrals of France, its surface carved in shallow pilasters and bas-relief panels that emerge from the wall, like whispered suggestions of ornament. The ceiling vaults 35 feet above you, its plasterwork moldings gilded in 22-karat gold, and in the center of that vault, a skylight admits a column of natural light that falls precisely onto the polished marble floor below, shifting with the hours of the day like a sundial built into the floor of paradise. But the true heart of Linwood Hall, the rooms toward which everything else in the building seems to gesture, were the art galleries on the upper floor, accessible via a grand staircase of white marble whose balusters were carved from a single continuous stone rather than assembled from individual elements, a feat of craftsmanship that reportedly astonished even the most experienced stonemasons on the project. The galleries at Linwood Hall were not arranged in the generic fashion of public museums. They were named for the artists whose works hung inside them. There was the Rembrandt Room, hung with 8 of the Dutch masters' oils, their surfaces dark and warm and luminous, the painted faces looking out at you with the disconcerting intimacy of people who know exactly who they are. There was the Raphael room, where three altarpieces of the Italian Renaissance master radiated the specific quality of light that Raphael, alone among painters, seemed able to summon from raw pigment. A light that was not yellow but golden, not bright but warm, the light of a world that had been perfected. There was the Van Dyck room, where 11 of the Flemish court painters' aristocratic portraits lined the walls, their subjects dressed in silks and pearls, looking across the centuries at Peter Widener with an expression that might have been recognition. The collection had been assembled over 3 decades with the help of the Devine brothers, the most powerful art dealers in the world, whose ability to source and authenticate masterworks from the dispersed collections of European aristocracy was unrivaled. Joseph Devine, the firm's flamboyant principal, reportedly told Widener once that the collection at Linwood Hall was comparable to anything held in the great museums of Europe. The total value of the works, catalogued at various points between 1900 and 1940, ranged in estimates from $15 million to $50 million. In today's terms, somewhere between $500 million and $2 billion hanging on the walls of a private house in suburban Pennsylvania. Gainsborough, Reynolds, Degas, Franz Halsch, Velázquez, El Greco, Titian, Bellini, Donatello, Monet. The names sound like an incantation. The walls of Linwood Hall were an incantation. John Singer Sargent, the greatest portraitist of the Gilded Age, came to Linwood Hall and painted Peter Widener himself in those galleries. A full-length portrait that shows the old man standing among his collection with the quiet authority of a man who has never once doubted his right to be exactly where he is. The painting now hangs in the National Gallery of Art. Look at it. The face is broad, the eyes are direct. The expression is a compound of satisfaction and melancholy that you only see in people who have built exactly what they set out to build and discovered. In the completed edifice, a loneliness they had not anticipated. Beyond the galleries, the 110 rooms of Linwood Hall formed a world unto itself. The ballroom could accommodate 1,000 guests in the kind of comfort that lesser ballrooms could not manage with 500. Its floor was parquet, laid in a herringbone pattern of matched walnut and oak, its surface polished to such a high reflective gloss that the room's chandeliers, each one containing 200 individual electric light globes, supplied by the atelier of E.F. Caldwell, New York's premier manufacturer of decorative metalwork, appeared to float below the floor as well as above it. The walls of the ballroom were hung with French silk damask in a shade that contemporary accounts describe as somewhere between ivory and gold. Installed in panels framed by carved and gilded wood moldings sourced from a dismantled French chateau that the Devine brothers had acquired somewhere in the Loire Valley. The billiards room was paneled in dark English walnut, its ceiling coffered in a pattern of deep geometric recesses that absorbed sound and created an atmosphere of masculine concentration. The library held thousands of volumes, not decorative volumes purchased by the yard for their matching bindings, but actual books selected and read, their spines softened with use. The tea room was perhaps the most intimate and technically extraordinary room in the house. Its ceiling was not plaster or carved stone, but a skylight designed and executed by Louis Comfort Tiffany, whose leaded glass panels and patterns of morning glories and wisteria transformed in natural light into something that could only be called stained, not in the ecclesiastical sense, but in the botanical sense, as if the light had passed through an actual garden on its way into the room. When sunlight hit that ceiling in the late morning, the room below filled with shifting pools of violet and green and amber that moved across the walls like slow, silent weather. The house ran on its own electrical power plant, installed in a dedicated building at the rear of the estate. This was not unusual for great houses of the period, but the scale of the Linwood Hall electrical system was exceptional. It not only powered the thousands of light fixtures throughout the 110 rooms, but also supplied current to the heating systems, the kitchen, the servants' facilities, and the estate's working farm, which occupied a substantial portion of the 300-acre grounds and produced the vegetables, eggs, and dairy that supplied the household's daily table. The estate maintained its own carpentry shop and upholstery studio, where craftsmen repaired furniture, produced new soft furnishings, and maintained the extraordinary quantity of fabric, silk curtains, velvet upholstery, embroidered tapestries that dressed the rooms. A full-time staff of 100 servants lived and worked on the grounds, their lives organized with military precision around the rhythms of the Widener household. 37 of those servants were permanently assigned to the interior of the house. The gardens that surrounded Linwood Hall were, in their original form, the work of head gardener William Klein Hines, whose formal arrangements of clipped hedges, parterres, and ornamental plantings extended 33 acres from the mansion's foundations into the surrounding landscape. In 1916, Peter's son Joseph commissioned the French landscape architect Jacques Griber, the man who would later design the 1917 rendition of Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, to redesign the gardens in the formal French manner, creating an ensemble of alleys, fountains, and reflecting pools that one Philadelphia newspaper described at the time as the finest French garden in the Western Hemisphere. For the central fountain, Griber engaged his own father, the sculptor Henri Léon Griber, one of the most celebrated sculptors in France, to design the fountain heads, bronze figures that poured water with the serene and slightly melancholy authority of classical mythology. On the evening of December 19, 1899, Peter Widener hosted the grand opening gala of Linwood Hall. The guests arrived by private carriage down the gaslit drive. The bronze doors swung open to receive them. The ballroom was full. The galleries were lit. The champagne flowed. Philadelphia society, which had watched the construction of this edifice for 2 years with a combination of envy and awe, arrived in force to confirm what they had suspected, that the former butcher's apprentice from North Philadelphia had built something that would outlast all of them. For the next decade, Linwood Hall was the gravitational center of American cultural life at its highest register. The Wideners entertained presidents, foreign dignitaries, industrial titans, artists, musicians, and scholars. The art collection was open to the public each year from October through June, a remarkable gesture of democratic generosity that was entirely at odds with the prevailing culture of Gilded Age hoarding. Visitors could walk through those galleries and stand 6 inches from a Rembrandt that no European palace would allow them within 50 feet of, and they could do it for free simply by writing to the house and requesting admission. The Wideners, father and son, seem to have genuinely believed what Joseph once declared publicly. Art belongs to those who appreciate it. Others merely own it. But even in those golden years, fate was assembling its pieces with a patience that mocked human happiness. The first loss had come long before Linwood Hall was built. In 1874, Peter Widener's eldest son, young Harry, a cheerful, bright-eyed boy of 15, was struck down by typhoid fever in the summer heat of Philadelphia and died before anyone could properly comprehend what was happening. Peter buried his firstborn son in the city's Laurel Hill Cemetery and continued building his empire, the way men of his generation and temperament continued all things, by refusing to stop, by measuring progress in dollars and miles of rail and paintings acquired, by keeping his grief in a room of his heart whose door he rarely opened. George and Eleanor had children of their own, and among those children was a young man named Harry Elkins Widener, named, perhaps, as a way of repairing the grief of the first Harry's death, who grew up in the galleries of Linwood Hall, surrounded by Raphael and Rembrandt, and developed, by his teenage years, a passion for rare books that was nothing less than obsessive. At Harvard University, where he enrolled with the class of 1907, Harry Elkins Widener became a bibliophile of extraordinary discrimination, haunting the great bookshops of London, Paris, and Boston in search of first editions and illuminated manuscripts with the same instinctive hunger for beauty that his grandfather had brought to the acquisition of paintings. By the time he was 25, Harry had assembled one of the finest private collections of rare books in America, housed partly at Linwood Hall and partly in his rooms at Cambridge. In the spring of 1912, George and Eleanor Widener traveled to Paris with their son Harry on a trip that combined business with the pleasures that wealthy Philadelphians of that period considered inseparable from business. They were looking for a new chef for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Philadelphia, which the family owned. Harry was searching for rare volumes in the legendary bookshops of the Rue de Rivoli. Eleanor was supervising the acquisition of the wedding trousseau for Harry's sister Josephine, who was to be married that summer and who was known affectionately throughout the family as Dimple. The trip had the light, purposeful quality of a family completely at home in the world. People who moved between continents with the casual authority of those for whom the mechanics of travel have always been arranged by others. Business and pleasure completed, the family prepared to return to America. They booked passage on a ship whose maiden voyage had generated an almost superstitious excitement across both sides of the Atlantic. A vessel that its builders had described, in the elevated promotional language of the period, as effectively unsinkable. The ship was the RMS Titanic. It departed Southampton on April 10, 1912. There is a specific cruelty in the fact that the Titanic was owned by the White Star Line, which was in turn a principal subsidiary of the International Mercantile Marine Company, the same company that Peter Widener had co-founded with J.P. Morgan a decade earlier. He was a major shareholder, in a very real and terrible sense. The ship that was about to swallow his son and grandson was a ship in which Peter Widener himself had a financial stake. He had helped build it. He had profited from it, and it was carrying his family home. On the evening of April 14, 1912, while the Titanic moved through the dark North Atlantic at a speed that her officers later acknowledged was too fast for the conditions, George and Eleanor Widener hosted a private dinner in the ship's first-class dining saloon for the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, and a select company of the liner's most prominent passengers. The dinner was described by survivors as elegant and convivial, the food magnificent, the conversation easy among people who had the shared social fluency of those accustomed to dining at the very top of the world. George Widener was 50 years old, vigorous and confident, his father's commercial acumen softened by a lifetime of cultural refinement. Harry was 27, funny and quick, and still a little surprised by his own happiness at being alive and young and in possession of so many beautiful books. They did not know. None of them knew. Death was already in the water ahead of them, floating on the surface of the North Atlantic in the form of an iceberg that someone, somewhere in the lookout above, would momentarily fail to see in time. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck the iceberg. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, she slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, carrying with her more than 1,500 human beings, among them George Dunton Widener and his son Harry. Eleanor Widener survived. She was helped in a lifeboat number 4 by her husband, who reportedly stood at the ship's rail in the cold and the dark and watched the boat pulled away from the hull. Whether he watched it until it disappeared into the darkness, no one survived to say. What is known is that George Widener's body, like his son Harry's, was never recovered. The Atlantic does not give back everything it takes. When the news reached Peter Widener at Linwood Hall in the pre-dawn hours of April 16, 1912, delivered by telegram, that cold instrument that the Gilded Age used for its most devastating announcements, the old man reportedly sat down in a chair in the main hall and remained there without speaking for a very long time. The marble floor was cold beneath his feet. The art on the walls, the Rembrandts, the Raphaels, the Van Dycks, all those faces that had watched his family rise, watched him now in silence. The chandeliers burned overhead. The house was entirely still. He was 77 years old. He had outlived his first wife. He had outlived 2 sons. He had built an empire and a palace and a collection of extraordinary beauty. And on this April morning, with the cold light beginning to come through the tall windows of his hall and the silence pressing in from every room, he discovered something that all his fortune had never been able to purchase: the irreversibility of loss. Money could lay the steel rails of half a continent, but could not run them backward through time. It could not return the dead to the rooms where they had been alive. He was never the same. Those who knew him in the years after the Titanic described a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, who moved through his magnificent house as if measuring the distance between himself and something he could no longer name. He continued to conduct his affairs. He reviewed the accounts. He attended to the management of the estate. But the light that his contemporaries had always described in him, that hawk-sharp, forward-looking, calculating light, had been replaced by something quieter and sadder. He sat more. He walked the galleries alone, standing in front of the paintings with a stillness that suggested he was no longer evaluating them, but addressing them, or perhaps being addressed. Eleanor Widener, his surviving daughter-in-law, channeled her grief into something that would outlast all of them. In 1915, the same year Peter Widener died, she donated a sum then reported at $3.5 million to Harvard University to construct the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library as a memorial to her son. That library, which opened in June of 1915 and now houses 3.5 million volumes, stands today as the centerpiece of Harvard's library system. Its reading rooms visited by hundreds of thousands of scholars every year. Its memorial room still containing Harry's own personal collection of 3,000 rare books, including, reportedly, a copy of the 1598 first edition of Francis Bacon's essays that he had purchased in London on the very trip that ended on the Titanic. Death could take the collector. It could not take the collection. Peter Widener's own body gave out on November 6, 1915, a date that fell with terrible precision 7 days before his 81st birthday, as if Eventime had decided to withhold that final small gift. He died in his room at Linwood Hall, in a house he had built as a monument to love and a fortress against impermanence, having discovered that no fortress, however magnificent, can be built high enough. He was buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, joining the first Harry Widener and, in the permanent geography of memory, if not of earth, the son and grandson whose bodies the ocean had kept. He had built a palace to protect his family. He had built a world for them to live in. He had hung the walls with the greatest art of 5 centuries. And in the end, the marble and the bronze and the Rembrandt and the Raphael had not been enough to hold a single one of the people he had loved most closely. The palace remained. The people were gone. The management of Linwood Hall passed to Joseph Early Widener, Peter's youngest son and now the sole surviving male heir. Joseph was 44 at the time of his father's death, a man whose temperament was in some ways the complement of his father's rather than its repetition. Where Peter had been a builder and an accumulator, Joseph was a curator and a refiner. He had grown up in the galleries of Linwood Hall and had absorbed his father's passion for art with an intellectual seriousness that exceeded even the old man's instincts. Under Joseph's stewardship, the collection continued to grow. He was particularly drawn to the Dutch and Flemish masters, and the Rembrandt room became, during his tenure, one of the finest collections of that painter's work outside of Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. He commissioned Jacques Griebert to redesign the gardens in 1916, creating the extraordinary French parterre landscape that would become, in the opinion of many visitors, the most beautiful private garden in America. Joseph also proved to be a more socially progressive custodian than his era typically produced. The policy of opening the galleries to the public every year, which his father had established, he continued and expanded. He added educational programming, engaged scholars, and became increasingly convinced as the decades passed that the collection did not ultimately belong to the Widener family at all. It belonged to whoever was looking at it. Art belongs to those who appreciate it, he had declared. Others merely own it. He was already thinking about what would happen when he was gone. The Great Depression came in 1929 and swept away dozens of the great Gilded Age estates. Newport's mansions closed. The Vanderbilt chateaus on Fifth Avenue were demolished for apartment buildings. White Marsh Hall, another Trumbauer masterpiece, built for the Stotesbury family in the same Philadelphia suburbs, shuttered its windows and began its slide toward the destruction that would eventually consume it. But Linwood Hall survived. Joseph managed the estate's finances with the same cold precision his father had brought to streetcar franchises, cutting costs without cutting the essential character of the place, maintaining the gardens and the galleries and the service staff at a reduced but functional level while lesser establishments collapsed around him. The house stood. The art remained on the walls. But Joseph was thinking about the future, and what he saw was clear-eyed and without sentimentality. His grandson Peter Arell Brown Widener II had written in 1940, in his memoir Without Drums, words that echoed through the empty corridors of Linwood Hall with the force of prophecy. The days of America's privately owned treasure houses are over. They're gone with the wind. Linwood Hall can, I suppose, be called the last of the American Versailles. It was an elegy written for a house that was still standing by a man who could already see the end coming. In 1942, Joseph Widener acted on the conviction of a lifetime. Working in consultation with the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the institution that Andrew Mellon had established in 1937 and which had been designed from the outset to house the great private collections of America's Gilded Generation, he arranged the donation of the entire Widener art collection to the National Museum. More than 2,000 works of art, paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, tapestries, illuminated manuscripts. The Rembrandts came down from their walls. The Raphaels were carefully packaged. The Van Dycks, the El Grecos, the Monets, the Degas, all of it removed from the galleries of Linwood Hall and transported to Washington, where it was formally received by the National Gallery on December 20th, 1942, and opened to public exhibition for the first time as a unified collection. The New York Times editorial board described the donation as the greatest single gift of art ever made to the American public. The galleries of Linwood Hall were now empty. The walls were blank. The rooms that had been defined by what hung on them were suddenly defined by their absence. Large, cold, echoing spaces that had once been saturated with color and beauty and now held only plaster and shadow. Joseph Widener died in October of 1943, 1 year after the donation, having completed the act that he had come to see as the purpose of his stewardship. The southern portion of the estate was sold for residential development. The house itself, the 110-room Neoclassical palace that had cost $8 million to build and would have cost many times that to maintain indefinitely, was quietly offered for sale. It sold in 1952 for $192,000. Let that number settle for a moment. A building that had cost $8 million to construct in 1900, the equivalent of $310 million today, sold for $192,000 50 years later. A building whose art collection alone had been worth between $500 million and $2 billion in today's values. A building that contained 110 rooms, 55 bedrooms, Florentine bronze doors, a Tiffany skylight, 9 varieties of marble on its floors, and 33 acres of French gardens. It sold for less than the cost of a modest contemporary house. It sold to Faith Theological Seminary, a conservative evangelical institution that needed a large building and had little interest in the architectural or historical significance of what it was acquiring. The seminary scrubbed the Widener family portraits from walls. The billiards room became a common room. The ballroom hosted prayer services. The galleries that had held Rembrandts were converted into dormitories. The seminary occupied the building for more than 4 decades. And during those years the house neither thrived nor died. It simply endured, quietly losing its ornamental details to deferred maintenance, its plasterwork crumbling in rooms that no one could afford to repair, its stone darkening with the accumulated grime of institutional occupancy, its marble floors gradually surrendering their polish to the friction of thousands of seminary students who walked across them without knowing what they were walking on. The French gardens fell into neglect. The fountains went dry. The alleys of clipped hornbeam that Grieber had planted with such architectural precision reverted to ordinary trees, their formal discipline undone by the indifferent democracy of unchecked growth. By the late 1990s, even the seminary had departed. In 1996, the property had been acquired at a sheriff's sale by a group associated with the First Korean Church of New York, purchased in complex financial circumstances that would eventually produce years of legal disputes about tax exemptions, maintenance obligations, and the property's threatened status on various historic preservation watch lists. The new owners had grand plans. The plans were never fully executed. The building sat. The roof began to leak in places. Water found its way through the limestone and into the interior walls, doing the slow, patient work that water always does on structures that people have stopped caring about. Vandals found ways inside. Portions of the interior were stripped, not systematically, but randomly, the way destruction always proceeds when no one is watching. A window gone here. a length of decorative plasterwork pulled from cornice there. The Tiffany skylights survived, miraculously. The bronze doors held. The marble floors persisted, though their surface was now covered in the grime of decades, and in places the frost heave of winters spent without heat had begun to lift the mosaic tiles from their mortar beds. Explorer photographers began to document the interior, posting their photographs online in the years after 2010. And those photographs spread across the internet with the viral velocity that haunting images always achieve in the digital age. Linwood Hall became famous in a new way. Not as a monument to Gilded Age achievement, not as a gallery of masterworks, but as a ruin, an abandoned mansion, a place where the ghost of an extraordinary past had been left to decay in full photographic view. Hundreds of thousands of people, many of them born decades after the last servant walked those corridors, looked at those photographs and felt something they could not entirely name. Something that was part admiration, part sorrow, part an uneasy recognition that the distance between grandeur and ruin is shorter than human ambition ever wants to believe. The house waited. Outside its iron gates, Elkins Park went about its business. The highway ran nearby. The houses of a suburban development occupied the land that had once been the estate's southern parkland. In Linwood Hall, all 268 feet of it, its limestone facade intact, its bronze doors shut against the world, waited with the patient, slightly reproachful dignity of a great building that knows it was built to last longer than the civilization that abandoned it. The waiting ended, or began to end, in February of 2023. A newly formed non-profit organization, the Linwood Hall Preservation Foundation, announced that it had entered into a purchase agreement for the property. The terms were finalized on June 27, 2023, and the mansion, the last of the American Versailles, the empty palace at the center of one of the most extraordinary stories in American history, changed hands for $9 million. Not the $192,000 of the seminary sale. Not the $8 million of the original construction. $9 million, which in the context of what stands at 1,000, Ashbourne Road represents not a price, but an intention. The intention to bring this building back from the edge of dissolution and give it a future worthy of its past. The foundation's plans envision a full restoration of the mansion and its gardens, the opening of the grounds to the public as a park, and the conversion of the house into a venue for educational and cultural programming. In 2025, Linwood Hall was formally listed on the National Register of Historic Places, official recognition at last of what anyone who has ever stood in that main hall and looked up at its gilded plasterwork has always known, that this building is not merely a relic of private wealth, but a document of American history, a three-dimensional record of what this country built in the years when it was becoming itself. The restoration is a slow project, as all true restorations must be. The asbestos remediation alone required years of careful work. The cost of returning those rooms to something approaching their original condition, relaying the mosaic marble, re-gilding the plaster, restoring the Tiffany skylight, replanting the French gardens, rebuilding the fountain that Henri Leon Grieber's bronze faces once presided over, will be measured in tens of millions of dollars and in decades of patient, skilled labor. But the building is standing. The bronze doors are still there. The bones of the thing, laid in Indiana limestone and structural steel by Horace Trumbauer's craftsmen at the turn of the 20th century, have proven exactly as durable as Trumbauer intended them to be. He built it to last. It has lasted. And so we return at the end to where we began, to that cold November morning in 1915, to the gray sky over Elkins Park, to the man lying in an upstairs room of the palace he built while the rest of the house held its breath around him. Peter Arrell Brown Widener, the former butcher's apprentice from North Philadelphia, who became one of the 100 wealthiest Americans in recorded history, drew his last breath at Linwood Hall, surrounded by the marble and the bronze and the memory of everyone he had loved and lost. He had begun with a knife and a government contract and a talent for seeing in the pattern of things where the future was going to come from. He had built an empire out of that talent, and inside the empire he had built a palace, and inside the palace he had built a gallery, and inside the gallery he had hung the greatest faces that Western civilization had ever produced in paint on canvas. and then he had opened the doors and let the world in to look at them. What does it mean, the story of Linwood Hall? What does it say to us, standing here in the 21st century, looking back across 125 years at the arc of a family's fortune? It says, perhaps, what all great stories say, that the things we build to protect what we love cannot protect it, that the walls we raise against time are ultimately decorative, not defensive, that the Rembrandt does not outlast the man outlasts himself in the Rembrandt, that the fortune of 100 million becomes, in the accounting of a life, less significant than the dinner table at which a father and his son last sat together, or the books that a young man carried in his arms aboard a ship that was never going to reach its harbor. But it also says something more specific, more Widener-ish, more rooted in the particular genius of a man who was born in a row house and died in a palace. It says that beauty is not a luxury. It says that the impulse to acquire and display and share the greatest works of human civilization is not vanity, but vocation. It says that a butcher's apprentice who taught himself to see can open the doors of his gallery to whoever wants to look, and that what passes through those doors in both directions, the art going in, the public coming to see it, is something that money purchases but does not own. Art belongs to those who appreciate it, Joseph Widener said. Others merely own it. The Wideners appreciated it. And then, because they understood what that appreciation demanded of them, they gave it away. On a clear morning in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, if you stand at the iron gates of 1000 Ashbourne Road and look up the long drive toward the limestone facade of Linwood Hall, you can still see what Peter Widener saw on the morning of December 19th, 1899, when the gas lamps were lit and the carriage wheels were crunching up the drive, and the bronze doors had swung open for the first time for a world that was about to be astonished. The building is still there. The columns still rise. The windows still catch the light and throw it back at you. The palace endures. The family is gone. The art lives in Washington, where millions of people walk past the Widener Rembrandts every year without knowing whose walls they once hung on, without knowing about the man who bargained for them in European drawing rooms, and the boy who read Bacon by their light, and a ship that carried that boy toward a darkness no Gilded Age palace could illuminate. The marble is still cold. The rooms still echo. And somewhere in those echoes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of a man who began with nothing, who built everything, and who discovered in the building what every human being eventually discovers, that what we make is never quite equal to what we love, and that the only true monument to love is the act of opening the door and letting the world see what is inside. The bronze doors of Linwood Hall were built to last forever. They have outlasted the man who ordered them and the family who lived behind them and the era that made them possible. They're still waiting. And now, for the first time in a very long time, there are people on both sides of them who believe the waiting is nearly over.